Thanks, John. So I wasn't sure who was going to be here in the crowd, and many of you know far more than I do about all the issues as to what the answers are to John's questions, but I'll try to give my perspective and maybe a flavor of what the administration's focused on at this point. So go ahead with the next slide, or do I have that? Here we go. I have the power. All right. Maybe not. There we go. Okay. So why do we need a bond? Well, there are some things in the state that do need some help financially, and it makes some sense to have some support from taxpayers on that front. So for example, what's the future going to hold in store with respect to hydrology? Predictions are that we're going to have more rain, less snow. The snow pack on the Sierra Nevada is equivalent to about all the storage that's along the Sierra Nevada front. So that's going to be an issue for us, not only in terms of how do we manage whatever the flood issues might be, but also how do we accommodate the need for water supply in California. So do we need storage? I'd say yes. Does it have to be surface storage? Not necessarily, but I was reading an article last week about some challenges that were being faced by operators of a groundwater storage basin, that they put the water in, but it disappeared. So we have to be careful when we're talking about the panacea associated with that. So where are we with storage investigations? CalFed had funding for them. They slowed down a bit, but they are moving ahead. For example, the Shasta enlargement, the Bureau of Reclamation has a notice of preparation out, so they're moving ahead on the environmental documentation. But there are 5 sites that were part of the CalFed investigations. You may love them or hate them, but they're options for the state, and that's part of what the bond measure, which actually still is on the 2014 ballot, but the various bond alternatives that are being proposed do include some money for storage. And this is just some more information. This will be on the website in case you're interested. It's also available at the storage website. Okay, local projects. This is a slide that shows recycled water projects. Those tend to be a little more expensive than other alternatives, so it does help to have some incentivized support from taxpayers because, well, I think we all would agree that recycling is a good idea. My own background is a good example of being recycled in various places in the water world, so thanks to those of you who pay my salary. So recycling, desalination, other projects that may not necessarily be cost effective today, but could be in the future. It makes some sense to help provide some support for those as incentives. So the last component that I wanted to mention too is on the Big Darn Concrete Pipes Project, BDCP. Hissing, oh my goodness. How is it associated with bond money? Well, the conveyance itself is not proposed to be paid for by any public funds. It's going to be paid for by the people that receive the water. But the ecosystem restoration component, which is to reverse 150 years of habitat modifications in the Delta, does seem to make sense that we have taxpayers contribute to that. So that, out of the $25 billion, about $5 billion would be public funding, and that would pay for the habitat restoration projects here. 145,000 acres, 100,000 of direct habitat restoration, and 45,000 acres of agricultural easements to secure the habitat that currently provides. And this last slide just shows you where some of those might be around the Delta. So some critical issues from our point of view. The administration doesn't have an official position on what we need to do with the bond. And I don't have a slide, but let me just briefly mention that we're in the middle of preparing a water action plan with our partners in the other state agencies. And that'll be released shortly, probably sometime in October. And that will lay out where we stand in the administration on some of the topics I just mentioned, as well as others that are part of the discussion about the bond. So it'll be a draft, hopefully go to final in December, and it'll be an opportunity for everybody to have a direct dialogue with the administration about what you think the priorities ought to be and how those get translated into our ultimate decisions. So thanks.
Good morning. My name is Tim Quinn. I'm with the Association of California Water Agencies. I'm going to take going to make my task to sort of give you some of the rudimentary information about what's in these bond proposals. By the way, my answer to John's question, my board of directors would answer, yes, we definitely do need a bond as a source of public money to move forward in California water. And I do want to underscore that I work for a 35-person board of directors. Most people sigh or feel it's a way to get sympathy from an audience to tell them you work for 35 board members. But in point of fact, it's rather an interesting job. They are incredibly diverse. North, south, ag, urban, watershed, upper watershed counties, coastal, urban areas, and they work hard to deal with their differences and come up with common positions that reflect what California as a state needs. And you know what? They almost always come to a substantive decision. It's not fluff. They deal with the differences and the controversies amongst them to come up with something. And everything I'm about to describe for you has the unanimous support of that incredibly diverse board of directors. And it's not something that I give them and that they rubber stamp. They work hard to develop these positions themselves. So do keep that in mind. And let me talk a little bit about where Aqua is coming from. Oh, there we go. 2009, one of the most controversial decisions made by my board of directors. It was a split vote. You don't like split votes when you're an executive director of an association. It was 18-11. Some very bitter discussions, but the board thought that it was important for them as a state body to support the comprehensive legislation that was passed in 2009, and we support it today. By the way, if we had that vote again today, I don't think there would be a single dissenting vote on the Aqua board, but it was a rough decision. In essence, that legislation said comprehensive solutions for the co-equal goals in the Bay Delta watershed. The co-equal goals are ecosystem restoration in the Delta and improvements of water supplies statewide, and they're as important today as they were then. But that changed something, and I think the Aqua Board got this, that as you move from a world where your job was to supply low-cost water to your job is to supply things in a way that are consistent with co-equal goals, projects that move forward in the future are going to have a lot more public benefit attached to them, not just water supply, water quality benefits, than was true in the past. That's going to have to change your financing strategy if you're going to be successful. So we were strong supporters in 2009 for a bond because it could rise to the challenge of providing the public's share under beneficiary pays concepts for moving water policy forward. And we continue to support those concepts today. So we come down, yes, we definitely think we need a bond, although the board recognized that the bond we've got now needs very substantial change if we're going to pass it in 2014. And they spent 4 to 6 months. I had 14 of my board members on a task force that met 8 or 10 times, a couple hours a pop. John Coleman, who's the vice president amongst those 35 board members, was the chair of this group that wrestled with what do we do with public finance and how do we downsize the bond. And they came to some pretty substantive decisions. This is sort of policy-wise, and I'll show you some of the numbers on the next slide. They wanted to support a smaller bond. We didn't actually, this was all approved at the May board meeting of the Aqua board. And we didn't give them numbers, but the backwash was we would have to get the bond down at least around $8 billion, maybe even further. We don't have any religious opposition to earmarks. That's when a piece of legislation ties money directly to a particular project, but a lot of the earmarks in this bond were taking a beating from the press, so we wanted to get rid of them, and we've been advocating no earmarks in the bond at all, rather rely on competitive processes. In terms of priorities, where the dollars go, we knew we were shrinking a bond. Growing bonds is really easy. I saw it in the legislature in 2009, so did a number of people in this room. Going from 8 to 11 billion was really easy in a 2-week period. Going from 11 down to 8, a lot harder. And where do you want to prioritize things? The Aqua Board felt strongly that this bond needs to be about making the Bay Delta system functional again, about investing in that system to accomplish the co-equal goals, and they don't think just running away from the controversies and the problems will get you there. So our instructions were to protect those dollars that are going to that statewide system while remaining substantial amounts of funds for groundwater cleanup and local resources investments, in providing assistance for disadvantaged communities, which will be a major theme in any bond that moves out of the legislature. Nothing's going to move in the next 36 hours. It will be early next year by the time we get down to serious negotiations. This is the bond math. I hope. There we go. This is the bond math that we sent to the Aqua Board and let me review it with you kind of quickly. First, let me point out the categories of investments here, and it's really important. Nobody's really arguing that those are legitimate things for the public to be investing in. We're arguing about how much and how, but we have stabilized, this wasn't true 4 years ago, but we have stabilized the kinds of things that we want to fund in a next general obligation bond. At the top of the list, local resource development, and while we reduced that in the proposal that the Aqua Board unanimously approved, it remains very substantial. Think of it this way, we went back to the levels of 3 or 4 weeks before the end of session in 2009. That bond grew because of, let's just say, democracy at work, from $8 to $11 billion, and what essentially the Aqua proposal takes it back to where it was before it had that growth spurt. So there's still a very substantial amount of local resource development, but not quite as much as there had been before, with various categories protected because that's to bring our diverse constituency along. Second category, which I'm going to break out separately, one is investments in the Delta sustainability. That's ecosystem restoration and other things. And then watersheds elsewhere. And then finally, the storage for co-equal goals. I know storage is probably highly controversial amongst this crowd, but it's amazing to me as I've watched water policy in recent years how much less and less controversy there is around this issue. Even NRDC and others in their portfolio approach recognize the value of investing in storage so that we can go much more to a gulp sip than we're able to at the present time. So the Aqua Board's priorities were to protect that storage number because we haven't invested in storage previously. We certainly don't think that's too big. To protect that number, Delta restoration, because the Delta is the core of our problems, and we think we fully recognize we have to invest in ecosystem restoration in the Delta, regardless, by the way, of whether you have a BDCP or not. And the other things outside the Bay Delta watershed, we cut those back by roughly half, both the watershed accounts and our own accounts. And again, this was an interesting dialogue, particularly amongst our urban members who had a lot at stake here. But in the end, there was virtually unanimous agreement around that set of numbers, taking the bond from $11 billion down to about $8 billion. It's not the only proposal on the table. A slight correction to my vice president. I think he was referring to these 3 columns as being three bills. We have not submitted a bill to the legislature. We reserve the right to do so. But the first column, and I've broken these expenses down into 4 categories: local resource development, Delta sustainability, watersheds, and storage. Up in this is the Aqua Board proposal. This is SB 42, Senator Wolk's bill that's in the Senate, and this is AB 1331, Rendon's bill, which was produced by his Assembly Democratic Working Group. And I would argue that these 3 proposals, if you look up here, are basically on the same planet. Maybe not in the same ballpark yet, but they're on the same planet. The numbers for local resource development are pretty comparable across the top. These numbers differ a lot. In particular, the far less commitment to Delta investment improvement in the 2 bills that are in the legislature. Similarly, there's no zero for storage here. Bonds 5 years ago, almost many of them had a zero for storage. You don't see that anymore because we're starting to get the light that we need to find ways to agree with ourselves that storage is, in fact, an important part of a future of co-equal goals. And here the differences are, basically the Aqua Board's direction is, I don't care if it's controversial, I want the problem solved. And I would commend to all of you an op-ed in the Sacramento Bee just a few days ago written by Stuart Leavenworth. And he was, whoops, I didn't want to do that. Stuart in particular was interested in these very low numbers for the Delta. And he talked to the authors and they said, oh, we have to keep that low because we're afraid of the BDCP. And you'll notice that, by the way, my organization isn't out there stumping for BDCP. I've got members that love it. I've got members that are scared to death of it. We're working on bridging the differences between the two. But I don't have a single member that believes we should not be investing in habitat restoration in the Delta. So despite the fact that it's controversial, we believe that number needs to be high. Those numbers are way too low, and we're working to get those numbers up as well. Because again, from the Aqua Board's perspective, This needs to be about that big system, about what we did in 2009, about comprehensive solutions for co-equal goals. That's restoring the Delta ecosystem and improving water supply reliability. As far as Aqua is concerned, let's move forward. Let's not run from the controversies. Let's embrace them and try to deal with them. But let's invest in our future in a way that's going to advance the cause of co-equal goals in the Delta and elsewhere. And that's right. I think I'm within time somewhere. If you had a time card flashing at me, I never saw it. 30 seconds left? How should I use it? I'll turn the things over to Doug and look forward to your questions.
So thank you. I'm Doug Obegi with the Natural Resources Defense Council, and I get to provide a little bit of the environmental perspective. Back in 2009, I think you'll see that there's a lot of agreement amongst the three of us and really amongst the community as a whole on the need for investments in California's water infrastructure. The real question, I think, that's presented to us and will be presented to voters is how much of that should come from bonds and where should that money go? So let's step back a little bit. In 2009, we did pass this legislative package to really radically reform California's water policy. There's two main policies I want to just briefly mention. One is that we need to reduce reliance on the Delta. Even with a solution in the Delta, whether that's the Bay Delta Conservation Plan or something else, we're going to have to take less water from the Delta. That's a result of climate change. That's a result of environmental protections, the need to protect fishing jobs and Delta communities. So we need to invest in local infrastructure, local water supplies like conservation, recycling, groundwater cleanup, and capture. And there's great potential in those tools. And the legislature agreed with that. And so I think that's a real key priority for any new bond, because we've seen in the past when we've invested water bond monies in the past in local supply development, that's generated huge investments from local districts to match and exceed the state money and create real new water and real new jobs. The second key policy is the Water Conservation Act of 2009 that was part of this package that said we need to dramatically reduce how much water we use per capita. And it set some fairly ambitious goals, and it really changed the mindset, I think. And both of these bills really did, as Tim was alluding to, that it's no longer about delivering the cheapest water available. It's about making sure that we deliver water that's safe, that's clean, and that is sustainable for both the environment and for energy resources, as well as fisheries and water quality. And so you have this confluence of events, and you have this huge funding need. In the past, we've passed a lot of major bonds, and they have created new water. You know, Aqua's done an analysis that I don't know ever went public, but showed that investing money in local supply development, like water conservation, created more than 2 million acre-feet of water every year, you know, for the future. Was a real good investment in our future. But at the same time, the overwhelming investment in water supply is local. It comes from ratepayers, comes from all of our water bills. The state has a role to play to incentivize good behavior and to deal with truly public needs, whether that's investing in major restoration settlements like the Salton Sea, San Joaquin River restoration, other real public goods, and making sure that we can provide safe drinking water for disadvantaged communities, for those that really don't have it. It's still amazing to me that in this day and age, there are huge swaths of California that can't drink the water out of their tap. It's really kind of incredible that we have these pockets in our state, and we have a real opportunity and momentum to change that right now. So I do see those as two real areas where a water bond can make significant investments. That said, you know, NRDC has not formally taken a position on either of those two existing bond proposals or on the 2009 bond. I think it's publicly acknowledged that that bond would not pass. All the private polling, all the public polling I've seen said that it's way too big. It's been tainted as being bloated with pork. And so there is a real effort to reduce the size of the bond. But there's going to be a real healthy debate in the next 6 months. I think July 2014 is the time where the legislature has to decide whether they're going to take this existing bond that's currently scheduled for the November 2014 ballot off of the ballot and whether to substitute something else. There's a couple key challenges there. One of them is that, you know, surface storage is still incredibly controversial. You know, in our proposal, NRDC created what's called a portfolio approach for the Bay Delta that said, we should invest in the Delta. We should look at both levee improvements and potentially new conveyance, smaller than what the state has proposed, but new conveyance to make sure that we have that kind of lifeline should the Delta really fail. And yet, all the storage that we've talked about as part of our portfolio is south of the Delta, because we've seen that all these massive new reservoirs really don't make economic sense, and they certainly don't make environmental sense. You know, I've been spending the last couple of days looking at the environmental documentation for the Shasta raise, which is the first of these major dam proposals that's been sitting out there for more than a decade. It's got no benefits for the environment. And so there's a real question to my mind whether there's any reason for the public to be paying for something that might provide some water supply benefits but comes at huge costs and actually would probably be in violation of state law. The other key issue, so one of the questions is how much money do we put towards storage? And there are some parts of the state that are quasi-religious about the need for new storage. There are other parts of the state that are quasi-religious about the opposition to any new storage. And it creates a real dilemma because pretty much all the water bonds that have passed in the past have passed with strong environmental support. And it's hard for me right now to see a bond getting out of the legislature that would be supported by the public and by the environmental groups that has surface storage money. At the same time, it's hard for me to see a bond that gets out of the legislature that doesn't have the surface storage money because of the influence of some of the water districts. So there's a conundrum there. The other key issue with surface storage is how much legislative oversight will there be of that money? You may have noticed in Tim's presentation that there was a little footnote, a little asterisk that said that some of that money is continuously appropriated. That means the legislature has no role in saying how that money is spent, as opposed to all the rest of the bond money. And I think that's a key issue for us. There's a role for the legislature to make sure that that is a wise investment, that the legislature doesn't just give up and forfeit that authority to the administration, whatever that administration is, in terms of the storage money. But obviously, there's room for some storage projects, smaller storage projects that can be used conjunctively to make sure that we can actually put water into groundwater banks, because you can't fill up a groundwater bank when it's raining. You got to have some place to put that water for at least a short period of time, as well as to clean up our contaminated groundwater basins, particularly in Southern California. The second big controversy is the one that Tim mentioned, which is in the Bay Delta. You know, you've got groups that are virulently opposed to the Bay Delta Conservation Plan. The Sierra Club recently came out in opposition to that plan, to any plan really. And you've got groups like Restore the Delta and Food and Water Watch who have already taken positions in opposition to a bond because they see it as facilitating the Bay Delta Conservation Plan. Both of the bills in the legislature took the approach that we want to be neutral on the Bay Delta Conservation Plan. We know we need to make investments in the Delta and that they should occur whether or not the Bay Delta Conservation Plan goes forward. But as soon as the bond gets linked to the Bay Delta Conservation Plan, politically it's probably a non-starter without significantly changing the conversation right now. And that's going to be a real challenge. The last real issue, I think, is the size of the bond and how much of that is coming from the general fund and how much of that is coming from user fees or some other funding source. You know, right now, agriculture uses between 2/3 and 3/4 of all the water that's diverted in California, pays a fraction of the cost that us urbans do. Some of that is by virtue of existing senior water rights. Water rights, as a water rights attorney, I can tell you water rights are not fair at all. Part of that is because they don't have the treatment costs and they don't have the energy inputs of sending water over the Tehachapi's in Southern California, as was talked about earlier. But at the same time, there's a real question to my mind and to a lot of other people, what's the right mix of state dollars versus funding from ratepayers? Because we know that the single largest incentive to save water is your water bill. When you have a well-designed rate structure, you will save water because you save money when you save water. And when we put money into water bonds, into state funds, and into state taxes, you lose that price signal. And so there's a real conundrum here. How do we pay for what are truly public benefits? How do we decide what are really truly public benefits? But how do we make sure that we don't lose that price signal and that we do incentivize changes in behavior, whether that's reducing reliance on the Delta. We've done that in the past with Proposition 50, incentivizing reductions in Colorado River diversions. How do we make sure that storage money is going to be spent to benefit all of Californians? And how do we make sure that we do move towards those co-equal goals? So I have more questions than answers at this point, but that's appropriate. We're now, we have all of this fall to work with legislators, to talk to the public, and then next year to come to a decision. It may not happen in the next 6 months, it may not happen in the next year, and we may not have a bond until 2016 or later, but we have to keep making these investments, and the conversation, particularly around fees and that public share versus private share, needs to continue. Thank you.
I'd like to thank Paul, Tim, and Doug for their presentations. Clearly, there's not unanimity on this issue. In any time in California water policy and politics, there never is unanimity. The one person I'd like to point out who's in the audience who's played a very strong role in the development of water policy over a number of years is a former president of Aqua, Paul Kelly, who also had served on the Sonoma County Water Agency at one point. He's here, and he also was involved with the development of where Aqua is today on its proposed water bond. A couple questions. The questions will be directed to one or two of you, and if anybody else chooses to answer, you're more than welcome. The first one is to both Tim and or Paul and or Doug in this case. Does ecosystem restoration in the Delta limit or restrict residential or industrial development?
Well, nobody's grabbing at the mic, so and by the way, I don't regard myself an expert on everything you're going to ask, but I'll take a cut at it anyway. The rule number one is use publicly owned lands first for restoration. So there's a lot of state-owned land and other public properties, and that's where you would prioritize. And Paul, you can probably tell others. I don't know. I'm not aware of plans to use condemnation powers for environmental restoration projects. They might for a facility itself. So I think there is definitely a playoff between agricultural land use and that you have to respect and look at local decision makers on, and habitat restoration. But I don't think there's all that much conflict between residential land use and habitat restoration. Okay.
Very briefly, the only thing I'd add is that through the 2009 package and a lot of worry about flood risk, there's a lot of restrictions on land use in the Delta already. Most of that land is deeply subsided, and it can't be used for major industrial or residential development. But there is a real conflict potentially between habitat restoration and agricultural uses. Most of that land is farmed currently. There's no restrictions in the current bond to prevent use of eminent domain, and certainly there's concerns in the Delta community that some land would be condemned to make way either for the tunnels or for habitat restoration. It obviously makes sense that you want to restore habitat that is publicly available, but there's real trade-offs because the habitat that's going to be best for fisheries and wildlife may not be the habitat that's freely available that's already protected.
Just quickly, excuse me, on the issue of condemnation, our goal is to seek willing sellers for the properties that we'd be looking for habitat restoration projects. In the past, and the team that's working on this with us, their experience is that in major habitat conservation plan projects such as the Bay Delta Conservation Plan, there hasn't had to be condemnation as part of the process. So we're optimistic that when we do move forward with the habitat restoration, and much of it is already required under biological opinions. So even if the Bay Delta Conservation Plan doesn't move forward as a habitat conservation plan, or we don't have bond funding, there's still multiple types of habitat that we're obligated to restore. So that's our plan, is to do so with willing sellers.
Thank you. This next question is very specific. It's actually to Doug, but again, Tim and Paul can weigh in. And it is not a yes or no question.
Can I give you a yes or no answer?
Is there a place for the beneficiary pays principle in the water bond?
I think there is. The beneficiary pays principle is this notion that there are some public goods that are truly public, but by and large, most projects have benefits that run particularly to one or more beneficiaries. In the context of the bond and in the context of fee discussions over the past many decades, there's always been this idea lurking in the background, as we do with the polluter pays principle, that people should pay to mitigate the impacts of their own actions. I think the real question here is, and it's really hard to do from both a legal and scientific sense, is where is that line between mitigation and going above and beyond to conservation? And in theory, I think there is a place for public spending to go above and beyond what is already required, whether that's the habitat restoration that's required under existing biological opinions, whether that's helping to meet going beyond existing obligations like the salmon doubling requirements of the Central Valley Project Improvement Act. But in practice, it's really hard to find that. And there's been really almost no discussion this time around about any sort of fees to help pay back part of the water bond. When you look at the history of the State Water Project, part of it was funded by fees, but it's generally been costs borne by the project proponents and the water users. And I think that will be a conversation that's going to occur. The challenge, of course, is that no one really likes sending money to Sacramento because everyone's concerned that the money doesn't go back to benefit them. And fee proposals haven't really gained a lot of traction, whereas on the energy side, you have the public goods charge that's really been a model for a lot of folks as something that we could do in the water side, but it's never gained much traction.
I'd like to add a couple of thoughts to that. I spent most of my career wrestling with the State Water Project and state water contractors, and they pay virtually 100% of the cost of the project. I would point out it was a project designed in 1960. Contracts were written in 1960. Its goal was low-cost water supply. So the water users agreed to pay for 100% of it. You're not going to ever build another one of those projects, and nobody in my community thinks you should. We're building projects for co-equal goals. We're building projects that don't just have water supply benefits, but have public benefits as well. And you've got to, if you want us to move forward into this land of co-equal goals, which my organization does, you're going to have to change your financing strategy. Plenty of room for legitimate disagreements. I would argue, recognizing that that democracy rarely produces perfect. Perfect is the enemy of good when you're trying to push something through a democratic process. I think they have a pretty good answer to the beneficiary pays question in what came out of the legislature in 2009, and we ought to respect that. The vast, vast majority of any program moving forward is going to be paid for by water rate users. It's going to be a $40 or $50 billion program, no matter what happens over the next 25 years, and 80+% of that is going to be paid directly by people signing contracts and agreeing to pay bills, or by raising water rates so that you can pay for your share of local resources, et cetera. The vast majority of this stuff is going to get paid for by water agencies. They know that. They're prepared to do that. There are some things that they don't think they should have to pay for, and I think, again, if a local resource project can produce a lot of water, and we have done a lot of good with Prop 50 and Prop 84. I was a supporter of both of those. The organizations I work for were supporters of both of those. And I think there's general recognition at some level it's appropriate to incentivize locals to do things they would not otherwise do. From my perspective as an economist, that's where your target ought to be. If it's going to happen locally without your money, let them do it. If it's not, stimulate it. And there's a lot of projects that will not happen unless you stimulate that, a perfectly legitimate public benefit that we want to fund with this bond. Down into the Delta, you're talking, again, there's this cutting off your nose to spite your face thing going on that we're afraid of BDCP, so let's starve the Delta of necessary money so it can get natural functioning back. I think that's nuts. But you're solving problems my members didn't cause. It's not a water supply project induced. It's something from land use decisions in the past. We could go to the counties and say, you caused this problem, pay for it. But I don't see that as a path towards happiness and agreement. So again, I think that's another area, very legitimate public expenditures. Under the storage stuff, again, perfect is the enemy of good. But the storage chapter, basically it's the same storage chapter in all three proposals that I showed you. But most of their policies don't differ, with the exception of continuous appropriation, which we'll wrestle and argue about in the legislature. But all of them are aiming public dollars at public benefits, defining what those public benefits are, requiring that at least 50% of those public benefits be in the form of water flow and temperature requirements that you can't otherwise get, that the public's going to pay for those things that are not generating water supply benefits, and the water users are going to have to pay for the water supply benefits that come out of those projects. So again, there's certainly plenty of room for healthy argument, but I think the decisions that came out of the legislative process on what beneficiary pays means in this bond, as you can tell, I'm prepared to defend.
We couldn't tell.
I think beneficiary pays is already built into the bond because the public funds that are going to be paying for it are going to provide benefits that the public in general will be accruing, such as restoring habitat and salmon runs and smelt and so on. Just one last thing, though, on there was a mention about Food and Water Watch is opposing the bond because it could have a potential benefit for the Bay Delta Conservation Plan, even though the only money in the bond would be that associated with the public benefits of restoring habitat. Reminds me of the position they took in Marin County, where they opposed renewable power because renewable power through the Community Choice Aggregation Program might be a possible option for the water district to use to mitigate energy use associated with the desalination plant, and they were adamantly opposed to the desalination plant. So normally you'd think environmental groups would support new renewable power or ecosystem restoration or all these other good things, but apparently not in the case of Food and Water Watch.
Well, we all know in water and politics in California, it never makes sense. I'm going to ask a question. The Delta is imploding. Environmentally, it's falling apart. And if we do nothing, it's not going to get better on its own. If we don't have a water bond now or in the very near future, and the time frame is probably limited for us to be able to have success, what are the economic impacts to the state of California, from your perspective, if we do nothing and we continue on the same path for the next 10, 20 years?
Well, I'd say it would be disastrous. As Mark Cowan, my boss, who, by the way, was going to be here today except he broke his elbow, so he comments about the Bay Delta Conservation Plan that even though it's a $25 billion project, almost 20 of that being paid for by the water contractors, that we can't afford not to do it because of the potential economic impacts associated with disruption of water supplies from catastrophes like earthquakes or continuing decline of species. And it's not just for water supply, it's also for the health of an estuary, which has importance to Californians in general. So I think we need to move ahead and make progress and find funding to be able to pay for habitat restoration projects as soon as possible.
Quick comment, and I'll pass the mic down to Doug. There's plenty of healthy economic debate going on around these questions. I think it's undeniable that the economic stakes are large. Sometimes I think my community may overstate them a bit. The fate of Western civilization is at stake here. I don't believe that that's true, but I do believe this is the most important infrastructure challenge facing the California economy today. I mean, I don't know anybody that can make a straight-faced case for how our infrastructure works in that part of the Delta right now. It does not work for co-equal goals. So this is an enormous economic challenge with enormous economic consequences. We need to get it right.
I'm certainly not an advocate for doing nothing in the Delta. And I think most of the responsible environmental groups really want to see progress. But our vision of progress is a little bit different from the state administration right now, unfortunately. The fundamental issue in the Delta is that we're taking too much water out of the watershed. And we're creating basically a permanent drought both in the Delta and in San Francisco Bay with devastating impacts to fisheries and the jobs and people that depend on it. Habitat restoration is not a panacea. I'd love to say that restoring habitat is going to mean we can take more water out of the Delta, but the science just isn't there. We're going to need to do habitat restoration, and that's going to require some public funding, a lot of private funding, because a lot of it is real mitigation obligations of the projects. But ultimately, we have to restore flows, and that's going to mean taking less water. And that means we need to invest in local supplies. From an economic perspective, one of the numbers that I found most surprising in the state's economic report on the Bay Delta Conservation Plan is that the present value of economic benefits of reduced seismic risk, which has really been touted as the primary reason for, or one of the major reasons for the Bay Delta Conservation Plan, is $470 million. So you've got a $13.3 billion project to yield $470 million in economic benefits on reduced seismic risk. And that's really hard for me to understand. I do think that there's a need for new conveyance to reduce risks. And I think there's a real need to invest in levees to reduce risks, because new conveyance doesn't do anything to protect lives and livelihoods in the Delta. 80% of the economic costs from a massive Delta failure have nothing to do with water supply. And the more that we invest in levees to protect that economic, to protect lives, and to protect the environment, because frankly, when levees fail, those are the places that become places where native fish go to die, because they're predator hotspots, they're invasive species hotspots, they're terrible for the environment, by and large. There are some exceptions. So I do think there are potential huge risks, and that we should be doing a lot to reduce those risks in terms of investing in local supplies, investing in levees, and potentially investing in new conveyance.
The water bond, currently there's $3 billion set aside for storage, which I think everybody's agreed storage is critical, whether it be above ground, below ground, some sort of storage is necessary. How does desalination play into this? It's a source of water. It's controversial. Obviously, we're going to be talking about it at the end of the day, but it's not really part of the current water bond discussion, and it's a plant in Carlsbad has just gone online, and then there's other projects along the coast and here in the Bay. How might that come into play from a water bond perspective and or from a supply standpoint?
Probably over 20 aqua members along the coast are in one stage or another of showing interest in ocean desalination. Don't lose sight of brackish water desalination, which is, I think, an important part of our future and not nearly as controversial as locating something on California's coast. I think where we're coming from, it's one of the tools that we have to invest in. We have members that are prepared to invest in it. Every project is controversial, like what's not in my world. And the bond, by the way, would provide some funds for ocean desalination, particularly through the integrated resources water management planning activities. It's a part of some people's IRWMPs. But certainly we don't view it as a panacea. It's one of the tools we need to use. It's not going to fix the whole problem, and frankly, even a huge fraction of the problem, but we need to put together a whole bunch of tools, none of which solve the whole problem, in order to solve the whole problem.
Like Tim said, it is one of the elements that can be paid for with the IRWM funds, and in certain places it makes more sense than in other places because of the cost of it and the energy associated with it. So it's very site specific, and I think it probably needs to continue to be part of the answer, but it needs to be compared in terms of costs and economic impacts or environmental impacts to all the other alternatives.
How do we, assuming the water bond's on the ballot in November 2014, how do we get the members of the voting public, the Bay Area in particular, Northern California, to support an initiative that many believe they receive no benefit from?
I guess we'll have to help them read the bond.
Look, educate, John. What all the polling shows is that the voters on these issues are I've heard an expert use the word fluid. You ask them, are you for this? And well, they know they have a water supply problem. They know it's going to cost billions to fix it. They want to live in a state that has a healthy, reliable water supply, and they believe at a core level in ecosystem restoration. The way these polls typically go is you ask them, would you vote for this to solve this problem, and you get a substantial yes. Then you tell them all the reasons why it's a good idea. You get an even bigger yes. Then you give them the counter arguments, and you get a big no. They're very fluid. They respond to arguments. I frankly have always had a certain confidence in the innate intelligence of the voters as a group. So let's have this debate. Let's not hide from the controversies. Let's have this debate. Frankly, our side thinks we got some pretty good answers to the questions that the public will ask. Let's get those out there. Let's tell them why we think we need to invest in things that are persuaded as controversial, why we need to invest in the things that are not. Let's get it out there and let them vote. That's kind of my attitude on 2014. But let's not run away from it because they might argue with each other. They're fluid, and I think that because they're fluid, they'll go to common sense arguments. And I'm sure the other side thinks they've got them, but we've got a lot of confidence in ours. Let's get the debate out there and let the public decide.
I think the big question is what is that bond? If it really depends what happens between now and November 2014. If you have united environmental opposition, which is probably unlikely, but if you did, it's a real problem for a bond because these bonds depend on funding from environmental groups and from businesses to get the word out. Doing that kind of education campaign costs money, and people are, money's kind of short right now. So I think devising a bond that has a lot of public support amongst the broad sector of the community is critical. And then all of us can go out there and sell it and explain why it's good for Northern California, why it's good for the Delta, why it's good for fishermen, why it's good for the environment. But if we don't do that, if you have a bond campaign that's really divisive and a bond that is not broadly supported and has big sectors opposed, I think it's going to be really hard to pass it.
John, I want to emphasize, I don't think Paul disagrees with that. I don't disagree with that. We would like to be together on this bond in 2014. We won't throw the baby out in the bathwater to get there, however. So, and we did agree, and let's not forget, we did have a historic agreement in 2009. And I think there's still remnants of that, and we need to find ways to be on the same page if we can, because it's a whole lot easier to make co-equal goals happen if we are.
Again, to clarify for the people here in the audience, the current water bond and the governor's conveyance proposal, they're two separate issues, correct?
Aqua believes that they are. Without opposing or supporting the BDCP, you need to invest in the Delta anyway. You need to invest in storage anyway. You need to invest in local resources anyway. We wish the governor success in getting out there and coming up with Delta solutions that are more broadly supported than this one is at present. And I think we all need to work on that. But I think it's a mistake to condemn the bond because we're having an argument over the BDCP.
And Paul, you're going to convince the governor?
Build the tunnels?
Yeah, I do think there's a little bit of there's a difficulty here in explaining this because the bond really is not funding BDCP per se, but bond monies could be used by the Bay Delta Conservation Plan, and Jerry Merrill and other folks from the state are out there saying that the bond is a referendum on BDCP. And I think from a political standpoint, that's really unhelpful. You have such a controversial project that has real strong opposition in many quarters, and that's a real tough sales pitch. So I think, the legislature really tried to emphasize that the bonds that they're looking at are not about BDCP. They're neutral on the project, and the more that they get connected, the harder it's going to be to pass a bond.
Actually, and I haven't heard what you've heard Jerry say, but we want to be very clear that the Bay Delta Conservation Plan is separate from the bond, and particularly the conveyance part of it is not related to any bond funds at all. There is an intersection between the projects that are proposed as ecosystem restoration projects and those that could be funded from the Delta sustainability part of the bond. So that's one mechanism. In the BDCP itself, it talks about public funding measures such as bonds. So that there is that connection. So, but it would be sad and ironic if people voted against the bond because they felt like they wanted to make a statement about the tunnels project, because I'm not sure who would disagree that we need to do as much as we can to provide habitat restoration benefits. And Doug and I will have to have a further conversation because many of the flow issues, such as fall low salinity habitat, are related directly to the habitat. So if we had habitat in the Delta instead of in Sassoon Marsh, you wouldn't need flows to push that salinity gradient out to the Sassoon Marsh area. So that's the whole point of the habitat restoration projects that we're doing for the biological opinions. So we want to make sure that people understand that there's a disconnect there between the tunnels and the bond.
Paul, when we do Energy Water Nexus 3, you're on target. I'd like to thank our both Paul, Tim, and Doug for their candid discussion on something that clearly is the legislature is kicking the can on right now, but come January, when they re-engage, it's going to be a very controversial but critical discussion, and really it gets down to how the economy of the state of California moves forward and in what way we're able to continue to prosper as a state economically from our various sectors, from ag to manufactured goods. It's all going to be reliant on what happens with the state legislature on the water bond for 2014. So thank you very much for your participation today on that.